Hello, and welcome back to our channel, Coraljax, where we visit ancient sites and explore the history and folklore that surround them. In this video, we're covering the recorded history of Carreg Samson, going back over 200 years to discover how this site has changed, what has been found during excavations, and what it may have once looked like.
It sounds hollow.
In the early records, Carreg Samson was referred to by antiquarians as Longhouse Cromlech, or Cromlech of Trefin. If you're new to our channel, or not from Wales, you're probably more familiar with sites like this being referred to as dolmens. And to add to the confusion, in many parts of the world, the word Cromlech exclusively means stone circle. But here in Wales, and throughout our antiquarian record, it's important to know that the word Cromlech usually means a megalithic monument with a raised capstone and several upright supporters. But it's worth mentioning that dolmen, or cromlech, is a very general term. However, here in Britain, dolmen has become synonymous with portal tomb, while over in Brittany, dolmen almost exclusively means passage tomb. And in many articles, wedge tombs and court tombs are also simply referred to as dolmens. And although there is considerable evidence that court tombs, passage tombs and wedge tombs were once covered by a mound or cairn of stones, when it comes to portal dolmens, the jury is still out. But however familiar you are with all of these terms, my point is simply you have to keep quite an open mind about what something once looked like if it's simply referred to as a dolmen. So back in 1968, when the opportunity arose to excavate Carreg Samson, the goals were to investigate the chamber, establish the position or existence of a passage, and define the extent of the cairn, if this was possible. While they did conclude that there was likely a passage of at least 2 meters in length, they also found that the monument was constructed over a large pit. Paired with the discovery of 2 erratics near the monument, it suggests that the capstone was a glacial erratic, and that the pit had been created when the capstone was dug up from where it had been naturally deposited. But hold on, I'm getting massively ahead of myself. And don't worry, this doesn't have anything to do with Stonehenge or the human transport theory. Okay, well, maybe it does a little bit, but we're not going to get into that. Carreg Samson is a stunning example of the architectural and engineering skills of our distant ancestors. Of the many that survive in Wales, this is certainly one of the largest. Its huge capstone and tall uprights make it one of very few that are comparable to the iconic Pentre Ifan. Estimated to be around 5,000 years old, its capstone is perched on only 3 of its 7 uprights, and it stands proudly overlooking the stunning vista of Pembrokeshire coastline and Irish Sea. In the earliest records and photographs of Carreg Samson, the monument is incorporated into a boundary wall, something that we've seen at sites across Wales, such as at Gwerneinion and Ystum Ceged Isaf. But unlike at both of those monuments, in the 1960s the wall at Carreg Samson was moved roughly 10 metres away from the monument. But as was quite common with the early antiquarians, when they came to drawing and describing the monument, they did use some artistic licence, and generally chose not to include the wall. Our first reference comes from 1810, in Richard Fenton's A Historical Tour Through Pembrokeshire. From Abercastle ascend to Longhouse, and in my approach to it on the left hand observe a most perfect cromlech. The incumbent stone is from 16 to 18 feet long, very thick to the north but rather thinner as it inclines towards the south and the west. It is of a curious texture, having flint and spar bedded all through it, as have the columnar stones it is supported by, which are 6 in number, 4 only in contact with the altar stone, and those the 4 end ones. The tallest upright, and much the thickest, is 5 feet 6 inches high. 6 decades later, in 1871, we have an account from Sir Gardiner Wilkinson. He also provides this illustration, but apologies for the quality, it's very small and poorly digitised. Abercastell is on the sea coast, and near it is the Cromlech of Longhouse, or Trefin, picturesquely placed on high ground, with the sea and the rocky indented coast of Strumble Head forming the background. Its capstone is 14 foot 9 inches to 15 feet long, by 8 foot 10 inches, but of very irregular shape and varying in thickness, from 2 foot 4 inches to 5 foot. I could find no basin upon it, nor upon any other cromlech I visited in Pembrokeshire. The small narrow harbour of Abercastell is principally formed by the rock at the north of its mouth, which is an island at high tide, but which presents no objects of interest, except the grave of Samson's finger and some ordinary tombs of earth of smaller dimensions. With Carreg Samson being one of the most impressive in Wales and relatively easy to visit, there's no surprise that the following year we have another account, this time from Barnwell. The Longhouse Cromlech is the finest of those in this part of the country, and perhaps one of the finest in all of Wales. It is somewhat masked by the hedge and bank against which it stands, and which have not been introduced in the drawing. In Fenton's time, the capstone rested on 4 of the uprights. At present, it rests on 3. The 6 uprights, however, mentioned by him, still remain. It stands in an elevated position, with sight of the sea. All traces of its former covering have disappeared, as the land on which it stands has been for a long time cultivated. And although he includes a rather nice sketch of the Longhouse Cromlech, it's not sure that he actually visited the site himself. It was quite common at the time, and I guess still today, for people to report on these sites without actually visiting them, which has definitely led to some errors in accounts and people copying those errors or getting confused about which sites they're actually talking about. For the next 2 decades, records are pretty scant, but then in 1890 it seemed that there was a bit of controversy stirred up in the newspapers. Using the Welsh Newspaper Archive, we found an interesting letter in the Cambrian, from the 19th of September 1890, and written by Mr. E. Owen Phillips of St. David's. It's said to be written in response to an article that was published in the Times the previous fortnight, that accuses the landowner of removing stones and threatening to destroy the monument. The search for that article is unfortunately hidden behind a paywall, but if any of you do happen to have a subscription to the Times, and you fancy having a look, it was apparently published on September 6th, 1890, and if you want to take a screenshot and send it over to us, well, that'd be nice. Anyway, the letter goes like this. I have just returned from visiting the celebrated Longhouse Cromlech, which I am glad to say remains in its integrity, untouched by the rude hand of the destroyer, and I am thankful to believe likely to remain so. Mr. Griffiths, the owner of the farm on which the Cromlech stands, accompanied me to the spot, and I have his authority for stating that he takes the greatest interest in this magnificent monument of prehistoric archaeology and its preservation. His father-in-law, a former tenant of the farm, spent much time and labour in clearing away obstructing rubbish, in order to bring the Cromlech into bolder relief and afford a better view of it all round. A great improvement, as it certainly presents a more grand and striking appearance at present than it did when I saw it some years since. On my asking Mr. Griffiths for an explanation of the statement which appeared in a letter to the Times of September 6th, that a labourer who was engaged in grubbing up stones near the monument to fill in a gap in a fence, said that he, the owner, threatened to overthrow and demolish the monument altogether in order to construct a new bank across an adjacent field. Mr. Griffiths replied that there was not a word of truth in it, nor any foundation for the statement, and that very probably the man was a hoaxing stranger. The disturbance caused by the stones, which are now seen to be filling up a gap in a fence, does not in the slightest degree interfere with the stability of the Cromlech, which the public will be interested to know the present landlord is as anxious to preserve as carefully as it has been in the past. At the same time, I agree with Mr. Greville Chester that it was an oversight, at least on the part of the ecclesiastical commissioners, not to insert a proviso in the deed of sale for the preservation of so important a monument of prehistoric archaeology, since the farm might have found a purchaser in one whose conservative interest in this grand old monument was less than that of the present owner. As we've briefly mentioned, whether or not all cromlechs had a covering mound is something that's still debated. It was generally assumed that all Cromlech were covered by some sort of mound, be it earth or rocks. And during our research, we often find accounts of small and large stones having been quarried from the monuments. And we use the term quarry very loosely, but quarried and used for nearby buildings or for field boundary walls. There are also accounts of entire monuments vanishing in the process of local roads being maintained and improved. Monuments that have lasted thousands of years being destroyed in the last few hundred. And of those that survived, many of them were used as animal sheds, with dry stone walling added or adapted to suit this purpose. Therefore, it's not always easy to tell what's original. And even today, the dry stone walling at sites is often added or removed, such as at Carreg, where walkers may have been trying to create some protection from the elements, or possibly even attempting to restore the cairn and rectify what they perceived as damage. I hope it goes without saying that you shouldn't be moving stones around at any ancient sites, even if you think you're just putting them back. If you are suspicious something's been interfered with, it could be a heritage crime and you should probably report it. Cadw have been really quick at addressing any concerns we've had in the past. And if you do report it by any other means, it's always best to let Cadw know and check that they're aware of any damage that's done. Now, things have obviously changed over the last century, and if a landowner wanted to take a lot of stones from an ancient monument to repair a hole in their fence, they probably wouldn't be allowed to. And if they wanted to move a boundary wall that was created hundreds of years ago and ran through or was in contact with the monument, I believe they would have to report any planned changes with Cadw or one of the governing bodies. As that article from 1890 demonstrates, even back then there was some public support for protecting these monuments, but it didn't go so far as stopping people from taking stones or moving boundary walls. So the only reference we have to the clearing away of stones is that article, and the only real mention of the wall being moved is from the excavation report in 1968, in which they state, "The tomb is standing free of encumbrances, towards the edge of a large field close to the farm. But until recently, it had been incorporated into the southern wall of a wide farm road running to the head of the creek. The field was under grass in 1968, and was considered too stony to plough regularly, though it had been ploughed occasionally. If cairn material had ever covered this area, it had now been completely removed. All evidence for surviving cairn stones had gone. The existence of a bulk of clay in the southern trench may hint at the presence of a mound of clay rather than a mound of stones, but no definition of the area could be attempted. The large gap between stones 5 and 7 was originally thought to be the entrance, with the large slab to the north interpreted as a fallen passage stone. This assumption was proved incorrect. The north end of the recumbent stone was firmly embedded in the natural clay. The southern end was exposed when the pit was first dug. The implication of this is that the stone is a natural erratic. The entrance to the chamber was on the northwest side between stones 1 and 7. All the stones of the passage had been removed, and because of the presence of the pit and the absence of the individual stone holes, it was very difficult to recognise where they would have stood. They go on to say that the evidence for an orthostatic passage is reasonable, but not as clear as one might wish. There was some surviving evidence for 2 stones on the west side, giving a length of 2 metres. This would not have brought the passage out to the edge of the main pit, so it's probable that it was originally longer. The rather doubtful stone hole on the east side suggests the passage may have been quite wide, perhaps almost 1 metre. The most unexpected result of the excavation was the revelation that the entire orthostatic structure had been built in a large amorphous pit. On the south and east sides, the edge of this pit followed the shape of the chamber reasonably closely, but on the north and west sides, however, the pit edge was between 2 and 3 metres from the stones. The construction of megalithic tombs over pits is not unknown, and it's been suggested that the capstone may originally have been dug from this spot. The remaining erratic just north of the chamber, and another in the same field, lend support to this interpretation. In recent years, the chamber has been a convenient shelter for animals, and the topmost filling was a virtually solid layer of manure. Beneath this was a mass of small stones and broken shale, probably a modern infill to prevent mud and water collecting. This covered a layer of boulders and larger slabs of slate, tightly wedged. Charcoal was found both above and amongst these stones, but there was no evidence that it was ancient. Removal of these stones revealed a roughly horizontal layer of slate slabs, which gave the impression of intentional paving. They were set in a sticky brown earth with small stones forming a layer about 10 centimetres thick, which separated them from a lower paving of slate slabs. These lower slate slabs lay directly on a sticky yellow clay which represented the original floor of the chamber. It was a rather cleaner clay than had been found in the lower pit, and must have been laid down when the construction of the chamber was complete in order to provide a clean floor. In the centre, this floor would seem to have been free of stone. Lying on this surface was a quantity of sherds which represent almost 3/4 of the same bowl or pot. Although it's difficult to say whether the pot had been complete when placed in the tomb, the bulk of the evidence suggests that the tomb originally contained a single large bowl, standing on the floor just to the east of the entrance, and that this bowl was broken by subsequent disturbances rather than deposited as sherds. Only a minute fragment of burial deposit survived. A few small pieces of cremated bone were found at the foot of stone 5. These must represent the last surviving fragments of a cremation burial, probably placed without protection on the floor at the foot of the stone. A majority of the flints found were simply broken beach pebbles, most of them of very bad quality and useless for tools. A high proportion of them were rolled and were no doubt natural inclusions in the glacial drift. The pottery and the cremated bone are the only finds unambiguously associated with the tomb. Since the chamber has been so heavily disturbed, it's not possible to say that they must be primary to the period of use. The excavation of Carreg Samson has not provided any very significant new information relevant to the wider problems of megalithic tombs, but as one of the few excavations of a tomb of its kind in Wales, it has furnished some facts which may prove useful. The shape of the chamber and of the position of the passage have been confirmed, but the shape and size of the cairn remain unknown, although the cairn may be confidently assumed to have been round. Carreg Samson can be seen as a member of a widely scattered group of tombs, linked perhaps by their very simplicity rather than by any notable features which might suggest a close and continuing contact between farming groups who built in this style in Brittany, southwest England, Ireland, Wales and Scotland. However, the contrast with other early box-like stone tombs, such as the portal dolmens of Wales, does seem to be a genuine and must have some social and historical importance, especially since the chronological evidence, where it exists, suggests that they should be broadly contemporary, and in southwest Wales both groups are present. It is to be hoped that further work on the many tombs in this area will add precision to this picture. There have been no subsequent excavations at Carreg Samson, and despite the hopes at the end of the excavation report, there hasn't been much further work at the other tombs in the area. We do know that the likes of George Nash have been studying the rock art on many of these monuments and looking at the implications or connections that can be established through this, but we're saving that for a future video where we can put it in the proper context. So to finish off this video, we're just going to have a quick think about what Carreg Samson might have looked like when it was first built. Now, on Covlin's website, where they summarise the excavation, they write that this revealed 4 additional stone holes, one having supported a further chamber stone, the others indicating a possible passage leading off to the northwest. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the wording, one having supported a further chamber stone. I think that statement should be taken with a pinch of salt. I've read the excavation report about 5 times already, and Coral's read it before me, summarising it and doing the initial research for the script. And I can't find this sentence anywhere. I've tried the different search options, searching different words. I've literally read through it. It's not there. It's not there. Now, as always, a link to the full excavation report will be in the description. So if you want to go and check me on that one, please do. I really hope it's not there somewhere obvious. But honestly, I really don't think it's there. Maybe I'm just being a bit pedantic, but this is the official source, and so the official summary of the excavation. And it seems to say something that just isn't in the report. So if it had supported another chamber stone, we're imagining that this is going to be more like a monument that had sort of corbelled chamber stones. Anyway, we would assume that any passage stones would be supporting a lintel on top, very much like our logo here. But to say that one of them was supporting a further chamber stone seems like a bit of a leap. I'm all up for any evidence that they weren't all originally covered with covering mounds. Because if anyone said that Stonehenge was covered by a covering mound, or that it was once some sort of giant indoor amphitheatre, people generally roll their eyes and say that's a bit far-fetched. So we know that there's some sort of precedent for Neolithic cultures holding huge outdoor ceremonies. And if we know that a lot of these monuments were very much linked to the stars and the moon, and very specifically the sun, it just doesn't seem too crazy that some monuments may have been indoor structures with indoor chambers, but it also seems plausible that there would be some outdoor structures. And of course, we don't really know what some of the large stone circles were all about. There seem to be corridor stones at a lot of stone circles that might be guiding a crowd of people to follow a certain path to the circle and maybe even away from it. So it doesn't seem too crazy that in a pride of place on a hilltop overlooking the sea, where you've got such a wonderful landscape and powerful point to be stood on. I've always been drawn to the idea that the capstones were actually some stand that people were stood on top of. Now, obviously, we have the likes of Newgrange and Noath, and we have lots of these underground mounds being found up in Scotland, and we have like Skara Brae, etc., etc. So what we can learn from those sites when we actually find them still covered is so much more than what we can guess about these sites that we essentially just have the skeletons of. But that doesn't mean that just because we found some sites with a covering mound, that all of the other ones definitely had them stripped off in the last few hundred years. And once again, this is only a personal theory at the moment, but I don't think that there's enough evidence to say that Pentre Ifan had a Cotswold 7 type mound all the way around it with the horns. There is some evidence that it might have been changed in stages, but if you look at the best evidence we have for a mound at Pentre Ifan, it's actually a very small mound that could even just be the leftover of a gravel pavement. We've got a fair amount of evidence that they would have been doing some sort of ceremonies or at least large gatherings of people at these sites. And creating a raised area which isn't going to be wet and muddy doesn't seem too far out of the possibilities here, and it would be well within their capabilities. So, what I'm saying is, the implication from the summaries of the excavation reports kind of make out we know more than we do. But it seems the strongest theory is that Carreg Samson was once covered by a large mound of earth and stones, and that there would have been a very similar passageway to the reconstructed passageway at Bryn Celtyddi and the suggested passageway at Bar Clodiad Gawres. In the report, they mention that the hanging stone, another one pretty local to us, is also of this type and has evidence of also having passage stones, but with 4 very different architectural designs that at their base have a very similar dolmen or cromlech. It's very difficult to know for sure what they actually would have looked like back when they were originally constructed. So, although the leading theory is that there was a round cairn and a passageway, perhaps the only reason it looks significantly different to Pentre Ifan is because of the stones that were lying around, left discarded by previous glaciers. If these very practical early farmers that had a good knowledge of how to move large stones needed to clear their fields and at the same time build some sort of monument, it seems only logical they'd use what's around. And of course, using what's there is much easier than transporting something a great distance. So with the first stage at a lot of sites seeming to be digging a large pit and removing a glacial erratic from the centre of it, it seems like perhaps the location and the overall size and design of the monument may well be dictated by what's originally there, not just by the design of the local community. Now, there's a temptation to go a little bit off topic at the end of this video, but I'm just going to give a teaser of what we're going to talk about in the future. You see, When looking at a lot of these monuments across Wales and the rest of the world, you do notice a lot of strong similarities. And as mentioned at the end of the excavation report, these monuments in Wales may be more connected by their simplicity rather than any of their other design features. You see, these could just be the early monuments that some of the later complex monuments evolved from. Dating these sites is incredibly difficult, and so we are left with a series of estimates. With structures like Carreg Samson and the Hanging Stone, we're looking at polygonal chambers very similar to Bryn Celli Ddu. But if you look at Barclodiad y Gawres, the chamber structure was much more cruciform, and if you look at a number of monuments over in Ireland, the cruciform shape is very common. As these monuments get more complex and have larger and multiple internal chambers, the capstones often get a little bit more complicated. Rather than just simple lintels bridging the gap between 2 or 3 stones, we start to see corbelled systems being used. At its most rough or basic, the corbels are just multiple lintels overlapping each other, but as they get a little bit more complex or sophisticated, they start to look very similar to the type of architecture that we see in pyramids. Now, of course, the likes of Pentre Ifan are thought to be 1,000 years older than the pyramids, and with so many different types of architecture using these large megaliths happening all around the world, it's not impossible to think that different communities were trading with each other and learning from each other. But it's also not impossible that it was just such a simple, useful, practical building design, using rocks stacked on top of each other, that it started being used independently all around the world. There's interesting research into whether or not ideas can happen spontaneously at the same time on opposite sides of the world, or whether they're more likely to be influenced by each other. But either way, there's a striking resemblance between the corbelled roofs on some of these ancient burial mounds and the corbelled roofs in the ancient pyramids. There's also a striking resemblance to these cruciform-shaped chambers within these ancient burial mounds, and the cruciform shape in early Christian buildings, which have obviously carried on through to today. So your mind does start to wonder if there is actually some unbroken chain, that our civilizations have never actually been completely wiped out, and that this knowledge has been passed on for thousands and thousands of years, slowly evolving and changing with our different mysticisms, superstitions, and beliefs. But whatever you believe, thanks for joining us and watching this video. I hope you can tell that we're passionate about this topic and we love researching it. And if you're into this sort of thing too, please subscribe. We've got a big backlog of videos and we'll be back soon with more.